Derrida corrupts Nietzsche to defend God. The philosopher John D. Caputo wrote a book about the post-structuralist philosopher Jacques Derrida. It's called The Prayers and Tears of Jacques Derrida, Religion Without Religion. Caputo writes about the famous existentialist philosopher Nietzsche, who's everyone's heard about, and Derrida's differing opinions on God, Nietzsche's concept of difference, and apophatic or negative theology. Difference, not difference. I'm going to start with a summary of my previous video on this book. Check out that one first if you want a little more context for this one. It's called Derrida Betrays Nietzsche. This one is Derrida corrupts Nietzsche. Anyway, I often mention Foucault. Remember that the Marxist and precursor to post-structuralism Deleuze had a large influence on Foucault. Deleuze summarized Nietzschean difference as an irreducible, deconstructible difference. Clearly, this means that both Derrida and Deleuze break from Foucault in terms of the extent to which deconstruction can be applied. Derrida used what is called apophatic theology to save God from deconstruction and create a post-structuralist or postmodernist God. Apophatic theology is essentially negative theology, meaning that we figure out what God is by determining what God is not. God is not this, therefore it might be this, etc. Some people believe in a literal God. Derrida is more comfortable with the post-structuralist, pretty metaphorical one, which former clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson ironically seems to believe in spite of his endless strawmans against so-called postmodernism. Metaphorical does not necessarily mean post-structuralist, but it is often an aspect of post-structuralism. I'll now explain how Derrida applies difference to apophatic theology in order to create an evil postmodern God. Through apophatic or negative theology, Derrida describes the impossible situation that Nietzschean difference allows for a post-structuralist God, yet God itself is not difference. Remember, not difference, difference. This reminds me that in addition to influencing Nietzsche, who influenced Foucault and Derrida, Deleuze had a wild but interesting theory that everything is difference and repetition. But Nietzsche's difference is even more different than different. Anyway, Caputo said that the messianic tone of Derrida's deconstruction was not evident from the start. Remember, Derrida used deconstruction to be favorable to God, while Foucault often deconstructed religion with a critical mindset. At first, Derrida's deconstruction seemed to be in the midst of a dominant Nietzschean tone in French philosophy in the 60s. But he thought of an objection to this view that coincided with his first encounter with theology. This was his spin on Nietzsche's difference to justify the supposed impossibility of God being deconstructed. His deconstruction adopted a more messianic tone. He was shocked that philosophers were criticizing rather than commending him for resifting the procedures of negative theology. Remember, negative theology is apophatic theology. Derrida's deconstruction became more favorable to God due to his justification through Nietzsche's difference, and he used apophatic or negative theology to reconstruct some kind of post-structuralist, somewhat metaphorical God. He puts these procedures to work in the service of some magical mysterium called difference. So, Derrida and Foucault were in opposition in terms of the deconstruction of theology. Deleuze had a large influence on Foucault, and Nietzsche had a large influence on both of them. Foucault and Derrida used Nietzsche's concept of difference, essentially meaning even more different than different, in opposite ways. Foucault was even more of a Nietzschean in general than Derrida, but obviously Nietzsche was very anti-Christian. He was even more of a militant atheist than Sam Harris ever was. He literally wrote a book called The Antichrist. So Nietzsche clearly didn't think up difference to justify God's essential nature. Foucault used Nietzsche's opinions to help him deconstruct God. Derrida used Nietzsche's difference to claim that God is deconstructible. Derrida used apophatic or negative theology, basically meaning that we define God by determining what it is not. He used Nietzsche's difference and apophatic theology to see God as deconstructible, while allowing for the somewhat reconstruction of a post-structuralist God specific to Derrida. It's important to remember this because dumbass pseudo-intellectuals Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay go around acting like every so-called postmodernist is super anti-religious. That's pure bullshit. Two of the sort of fathers of post-structuralism majorly disagree about God and religion. Also, Peterson clearly believes in something like Derrida's post-structuralist God because he never says whether he believes in God, but it sounds completely metaphorical when he describes it, or at least as metaphorical as Derrida's God is. Anyway, this is the main point. Derrida used Nietzschean difference and apophatic theology to justify a deconstructible, yet somewhat metaphorical, post-structuralist God. Derrida corrupts Nietzsche to defend God.